Hello everyone, welcome to the JK Academy. This channel aims to talk about architecture and urban design in the most simplest form. So I'll be introducing a lot of the really interesting aspects of architecture and urban design from Asia, especially Tokyo, because currently I live in Tokyo, and also from Singapore, because I used to live in Singapore until last year, and also about Africa, because I am doing a lot of research based on Africa, and also about Europe. So if you're interested, please subscribe to this channel. Today I'm going to talk about Singapore history, planning, and the reality. This is the table of content of today's lecture. Starting from a brief introduction to Singapore. So as you all know, Singapore is a very small country, and in terms of size, it's around 50 kilometers by 26 kilometers. If you're living in Tokyo, it could be a nice comparison because the size of Tokyo, just focusing on the 23 wards, which are the central area, is relatively comparable in terms of size to Singapore. Also, London and New York, they are quite similar in size. So if you are interested, it would be a nice research to do to compare between Tokyo, London, New York, and Singapore. Moving on to a little bit of history. The history of Singapore started when the British came in 1819. They started to rule the island because they saw a potential in terms of the trading between the Southeast Asian countries. So as you can see from this map here, there is the Malaysian peninsula here, and then you have Indonesia, which is a huge country around here. And so Singapore is located in a very, very nice spot where it can become a hub for trading between the rest of the Southeast Asian countries. So this is why in 1930 they started to actually locate themselves and then started to construct towns and architecture in this area, which is called the Jackson Plan. So this map is actually this little part here, which is the current central business district area in Singapore. So these colonial buildings are currently also remaining as an important heritage and conservation area. And this is the church that they constructed. And also this is the Raffles Hotel, which has this really beautiful colonial style architecture. So now moving on to the modern Singapore. Singapore became independent in 1965, and in 1965, the image of Singapore, which probably of today it looks something like this. However, in 1965, it was quite different. So I take a quote from Rem Koolhaas. It's actually written in his book, SMLXL. He has a text about Singapore songline. And in this text, he begins with a quote. I'm quoting from Rem Koolhaas. I turned 8 in the harbour of Singapore. We did not go ashore, but I remember the smell, the sweetness and rot, both overwhelming. Last year I went again. The smell was gone. In fact, Singapore was gone, scraped, rebuilt. There was a completely new town there. So this is a quotation from Rem Koolhaas's SMLXL. What does it mean by this? Is that when he was 8 years old, this, if we calculate his age, he was born in 1944. So when he was 8, it means that this was 1952. So this means it's before the independence. The independence of Singapore is 1965. So at that moment, as it's been explained here, it was quite smelly and disgusting. So what he mean by this is that actually during that period, Singapore had the biggest slum in Southeast Asia. So what he's trying to explain is that kind of city, the first impression of the city that he saw in Singapore after visiting it, which is the last year, which means this was written in 1995. So the last year he means is 1994, and in 1994 it means that already after the independence 30 years has passed. And so what he means by that, in 30 years time after the independence, everything has changed. So it means how radical things change, how fast and radical things has changed, that it completely scraped everything, and then it became something a new town. So as described, before the independence, it was a lot of slums there, and you can see from this photo, there were a lot of these squatter huts. This is what you see today. And how did this very fast radical change happen is what I want to explain today in the lecture. So this is the kind of framework that I have structured, taking quote from, actually inspired by a quote from a Japanese artist. His name is Taro Okamoto. And he say, when politics, economy, and art, they come together, you create a culture. So I rephrase the art with space because we are talking about architecture and urban design. So what I want to say is that politics, economy, and space became one, and this is what you have of Singapore. And if I were to be a little bit more precise, politics means a vision that was being created by the first Prime Minister called Lee Kuan Yew. And then he strategized, and he said that in order to change, you need money. So he also strategized in terms of economy. And of course, he materialized everything into space. So in terms of economy, what did he do? He took some references from Hong Kong and also from Japan. So, and then he joined these together. Because Singapore doesn't have any resource, the only way that they could boost the economy was to take this Hong Kong model, which is to make the city to be, the country to become a financial city. So he had invited a lot of foreign investment to actually build companies in Singapore. And then also he created a very pleasant environment so that these foreign people, they can live safely, and then they will feel comfortable living in Singapore. The second one is referencing from Japan. In Japan, we have an industrial belt along the Pacific Ocean. So he took this, and then he implemented also along the coast in an area called Jurong. And then what is quite amazing is that he materialized a lot of his thinking into space. So that vision is being implemented in terms of the creation of community, and then also the construction of a lot of housing. And this is what I think is the most important part to understand about Singapore urbanism. So moving on to the next one, which is about Singapore urbanism. So in short, Singapore urbanism is a collage of various ideologies. And in a bit more specific way, it's actually a combination of these three concepts, which is a garden city, neighborhood unit, and the Dutch Randstad. Okay. So the first one, which is a garden city, so because this is not really a lecture on the garden city itself, I'm going to just explain it very briefly. But those people who know urban design, obviously you would have heard this a very important person, Ebenezer Howard. And what he did is that he created this concept of the garden city. This is in England. And it was essentially the aim for this was to create an alternative living environment so that you don't live in the city area, because city area at that time was quite smoky because of the Industrial Revolution. It was a very unhealthy place to live. So with the garden city concept, he wanted to create something that is an alternative to live in the city, and also an alternative to be a farmer. So this is the general concept that he kind of he initiated, where you have the central city, and then with a very good transportation system, you have this mini city, which are the garden city, in a satellite kind of manner, and then you are very well connected with network, which is the train, which is a railway. So to kind of summarize what he has done in the garden city concept, first thing he did, the first important aspect is that because of the nature of the location itself, there is a lot of agricultural land around the garden city. So automatically it can prevent the sprawl. The second thing is that because it can prevent sprawl, you are able to make a compact city with a control in the population. So in the case of Garden City, he was saying that the ideal size will be 32,000. And then if you exceed this number of population, it's not that you expand the city, but actually you would expand by creating a new garden city. And then again, you will be connecting those mini garden cities with a good transportation system. And so because of the nature of this, it is a self-sustained city. And because people don't, it's not that people live here and then they commute to the city center, but in fact, they live and work in this satellite city. So this is the concept that he has. And the other important thing is that all the land belongs to the public. So no one owns the land in Garden City. And therefore, it is a cooperative model. And if the Garden City generates any kind of profit, then it should be returned to the community itself. So that's kind of like the basic idea of the Garden City. And the second one, which is the neighborhood unit. Yes, if you are an urban designer, of course you know this very well. Neighborhood unit. It is a kind of our modern urban planning concept. It's actually a technique, a planning technique to create a community. So the objective is to plan as such so that you are creating a kind of like a hub in the center, which in his case, it's important to locate the elementary school. And then the community size is the community size is determined by the distance from the elementary school, and then also the distances between different amenities and facilities. So this is to showcase this distance that I'm talking about. So all the houses, they should be within 800 meters, and then the playground should be within 400, and then like the shopping district should be within 800 meters distances. So basically it's the walkable area, and then these distances are because it's walkable. And then if you have a walkable community, then if you have a walkable neighborhood, then you are able to facilitate a community. And then another idea to actually create a pleasant, walkable neighborhood is to understand the hierarchy of the streets. So you put the arterial streets on the perimeter, and then gradually you have a smaller street in the residential area. So one important, or like one very well-known concept that is being implemented in this area is called cul-de-sac, and this is a complete separation of vehicle and the pedestrian. And the objective of this is to create a very walkable neighborhood. So the third one is the Dutch Randstad. The Randstad is a concept that is in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, you have 4 very important main cities, which are Amsterdam, Den Haag, Utrecht, and Rotterdam. And these 4 cities are being connected with this ring network. So the Randstad is essentially a connecting of a big hub cities, and these big hub cities, they have its own character. And the character for the case of Amsterdam is tourist, and Den Haag is a government, Utrecht is finance, and Rotterdam is industry. And these 4 different, let's say it's kind of like a city has its own role, which becomes the identity, which becomes the character. And then these different characteristics will be joined because of this transportation system that goes around in the ring way, in the ring manner. So the achievement of Randstad is that it creates a ring city, and then each node has its own identity to differentiate the city function, and then leaving central area as the green hut. So actually here there is a huge green area that they leave it as so-called the green hut. So taking this, this is a ring city plan that was being proposed in 1963, which is actually showing, this is Singapore. So it's very clearly shown this ring concept here. And taking this, in 1971, Singapore created the concept plan. And then this concept plan actually is trying to envision this ring city with a hub, with the central area here, the central business district that is here, and then this is the airport, and then this is the industrial area, and then this is kind of like a connection between Malaysia, and then all of this is being created, being connected with this ring concept, leaving the central catchment area as a green hut. So this is something new that I want to also include about the 21st century ideology. And this is a relatively new concept that they are trying to realize today. And it's a green system and corridor. This is Olmsted is a very important person that I think a lot of people will know. He is actually famous because of the Central Park in New York. He's the planner for the Central Park in New York. And so apart from New York, he also proposed this for Boston. And you can see the different green area, and then this green area has been connected with this green system, which is basically the green corridor. So Singapore is also trying to create a green network, and this is called Park Connector. Currently, the park connectors are still disconnected, but I'm sure that in a few decades, all of the area of Singapore will have a very distinctive green network system that actually bridge every little neighborhood with a green infrastructure. So currently you can already see a little bit of this park park connectors being connected. So moving on to Singapore housing. This is two different types of housing that you can see in Singapore. So if you separate the housing in a big cluster, you will have a chunk that is called the private housing, and then you will have a chunk that is called the public housing. So here in the photo, you can see the private housing, and then you see this, which is called HDB, which are the public housing. So private housing will be looking something like this. It's actually a gated community, but within, we call it the condominium. In the private housing, you will have some kind of facilities with like gym, swimming pool, and all of this within your gated community. And on the other hand, the public housing, they are for the Singaporeans. And then in fact, in Singapore, more than 80% they are living in public housing. So as you understand, most of the Singaporeans, they are living in HDBs, which are the public housing. And therefore, it is quite important to understand the history of public housing in Singapore. So to begin with, before it became HDB, HDB stands for Housing Development Board. Before HDB, it was called SIT, which is Singapore Improvement Trust. And then it was it started in 1927, and then it ended in 1959, because in 1960 this is when the HDB started. So the objective of this was actually to implement a lot of housing, but mostly it's implement as much housing as possible, but in fact the speed of the construction were not catching up with the increasing amount of squatter housing that were being were increasing in the city areas. So in fact, they thought that they will have to change the strategy, and so this is why the HDBs were being the HDBs were launched. But then, in terms of the architecture, the SIT has this kind of international style, and actually it's a low-rise apartment buildings, and the area that still remains with SIT, it's quite nice, and currently it's been a bit gentrified, so this is also something that we need to consider of today. And but in fact the atmosphere of this whole entire neighborhood is quite nice. So moving on to HDB. HDB started, it was founded in 1960. And so as I repeatedly mentioned, that before the independence, all these areas, the city areas in Singapore, there were a lot of squatter houses. And so one of the first things that Lee Kuan Yew wanted to propose was adequate housing for all the people in Singapore. And so this is why the speed of construction was quite important, and then therefore SIT, they were not successful in terms of the housing speed. So he created this other way, which is to implement more of a high-rise blocks. So in terms of the history of HDB, you can actually classify into 5 phases. So I will briefly explain you each phase. The first phase, which is from 1960 to 1966, is considered as the basic design period. So why is it called the basic design period? It's because this phase, the objective was really to implement as much housing as possible, housing blocks as possible, in a very, very, very fast way. And so all these are some of the blocks that were constructed during that period. And the famous area is called Queenstown. So Queenstown is considered as the first HDB area in Singapore, but in fact, it is a little bit different from the HDB planning, because actually this area of Queenstown, the objective was this emergency housing. So this means that the most important thing is to implement fast, and then therefore they were not really planning for the neighborhood. So the community kind of concept is not really there in this phase. So the real HDB planning comes in the second phase, which is from 1967 until 1976, and then I would label it the layout variation period. So instead of the emergency type, which was a very small 1 room, 2 room, a very small housing units, but in this period they were trying to improve that housing unit to make it a little bit better, and then to also implement something that has a planning concept, which I have mentioned about the neighborhood unit and the garden city concept. So this is according to different population size. They should have a certain amenities around the walking distance within their precinct. So this is just a very conceptual diagram. You have a town center in the middle, and then you have these small little neighborhood centers around it to create something that is called the neighborhood, and then each small little area here is the precinct. So this is one of the well-known neighborhoods in Singapore. It's called Toa Payoh, and then this area was built during this period, phase 2 period. So if you go there, actually you will find a lot of old estates that were being constructed in the 60s. It still remains there. Perhaps it's been upgraded a little bit, but it still remains. And then you will also see this kind of very detailing location of how amenities and facilities were being distributed within the precinct. So this is Toa Payoh in the 60s. The third phase, which is from 1977 until 1981, is the holistic urban design period. And the important thing that happened during this period was to introduce ethnic mix. So I think most people might know that in Singapore you have a lot of ethnic groups living in Singapore. And in order for them to have a real mixture, they introduced this scheme, which is called the ethnic mix. And then each area and each block, they will have a quota where only a certain amount of people, you are not allowed to exceed a certain quota of the same ethnic group. So in the case of Chinese, I think Chinese, they are 84% is the maximum you can achieve. Malay, they are 22%. And then also you have the Indians and the others, which are the 10%. So you are not allowed to exceed this percentage of the quota within each block or within each precinct. Okay, so this is the ethnic mix. The fourth phase is the intensification of land use period. So after all these lot of buildings, housing blocks that were being constructed, it kind of created a very homogeneous space. And so in order to make it a little bit more diversified, but then at the same time making it more intensified, they have proposed this checkerboard concept, which is, it's not something that came from this period. Actually, it was initiated a long before, but this one shows clearly how within this checkerboard kind of form, you will have different ways to distribute the facilities and services And then also in terms of the form of architecture, you try to make it so that the height has a different variation. So if I show you the photo, it's something like this. So you have taller ones, but then you have a mid, low rise and mid kind of blocks, so in a staggered way, so that it kind of provides a vista, and then it also provides kind of like a diversified image of the area. So this was something that was being introduced. And moving on to the last phase, which is phase 1, from 1991 until today. This is the diversification through privatization period. It's very, very long. The title is very long. But what I mean by this, in terms of diversification, is that, first of all, it's quite important to understand what does it mean by privatization. So the privatization is that the HDB, they will appoint an architect to make something that is not the standard types of HDB. So as you can see from this photo here, it's done by an architect, which looks quite different from the previous ones that looks more like typical housing blocks. But here there is a different kind of design for different types of blocks. And so for example, this one is quite interesting. In this one, you see kind of like a Tetris sort of housing unit here. So what does it mean is that you have one owner owns this one and this one, for example, and actually it's a maisonette. And then what happens is that you live with your father and your mother, and then when they, let's say, unfortunately they pass away, and so the grandparents, they might live in this block, in this area, and then the other family, they might live in this area. And then once the grandparent generation, they kind of pass away, you can freely do something for this area here. So the privatization allows for more of a freedom in terms of the design, but at the same time there is another kind of concept that was being introduced, which is BTO. BTO is built to order. It means that you order, and then after you order it, then the real construction starts. So this is to prevent from any kind of loss in terms of the stock, housing stock, which is currently is all the HDBs are being built in this way. So another example of the privatization, which is this one is very, very famous, and it's called Pinnacle Duxton. It's a 50-story high public housing, and it has 7 towers. So these ones, there are 7 of these towers, and then you will have 2 decks that are connecting the 7 towers. One in the 26th floor, which is this one, and then the other one on the 50th level. So the 50th level here, the highest one, actually is accessible for the public, but you have to pay a certain fee. You pay the entrance, and then you can actually climb up here, and then this area is I mean, you have to pay it, but it's kind of like public. And then for this one here, the 26th level, it's more for the resident who lives there. So the only people who, the resident in this apartment, they will have the card key, and then only with this, you are able to enter into the 26th level. In the 26th level, it's quite nice. They have the running track here. So if you go there, you will see many people running around this deck. And then I think there are also some little spots where you can do some different exercises. So actually it's quite a nice concept. Moving on to the characteristics of HDB. As I mentioned, HDB is not just about the housing. So the first phase, it was the emergency kind of condition. Therefore, they only built the housing blocks. But in fact, from the second phase onward, the objective is to create a community, and then therefore they integrate a lot of this location model that is being taken from neighborhood unit and also from the concept of the garden city. And then therefore, if you look carefully into this kind of precinct areas, there are a lot of activities that are happening there. So here on the first level of the HGB, this is the housing block, you will have a lot of these little shops that are for the people to buy their everyday needs. And another thing is that there is, before the independence, or maybe before HGBs were being built, there were a lot of hawkers on the streets. And so hawkers meaning informal vendors, and there were a lot of people who were selling vegetables and fish or chicken or like meat and all these kind of things on the streets. But after the implementation of the HGBs, they actually formalized these activities, and then therefore all the hawkers, they were being allocated with a proper licensed spot, plot. And then therefore a hawker center is a transition of informal activities to become formalized. Also same for the people who are selling vegetables and fish and meat. They were being given a license in a similar environment like this, and these are called the wet market. On top of this, below the HGB, they might have something that is called the kopitiam. And this kopitiam, you will see a lot of uncles and aunties taking coffee in this area, and then they will be chatting, and then they will be spending some time together with the community. So the kopitiams, they are usually on the ground level of an apartment block, but the hawker centers, they are usually allocated nearby, somewhere within the neighborhood. So that is the difference between the hawker center and kopitiam. Another characteristic of HGB in terms of space is that there is something called the void deck. So the void deck, in other words, in terms of architectural language that we would use, is the pilotis space. So this void deck were supposed to be for different kinds of activities. So in the past, you will see a lot of children, they were playing in this area, and then you will also see like uncles and aunties mingling and chatting, and then they will be actually kind of like taking the chair from their house, and then they will put it here, and then you will, in some areas, you still see this kind of setting where you have a small, almost like a living room within this inside these void deck spaces. But today they are also using it still. They are using it for weddings and funerals. So you can see the same kind of void deck. You decorate it, and then it becomes a wedding space. Now moving on to the next chapter. The next chapter is about SG50 research project. This research project was done in when I was in NUS, and NUS stands for National University of Singapore, and I used to be there until last year. And so this SG50 project was together with students from NUS doing some kind of event for the 50th anniversary after the independence of Singapore. So 1965 was the independence, and then therefore 2015 was this SG50 event. So this SG50 research project is about the 50 years of implementation of Singapore for the 55 neighborhoods. So how I did this is to do an exhibition through showing some various types of maps of the reality of today. So that means that the development of 50 years of history of Singapore and how it's been realized. And then the other side of it is here to show the 50 years later kind of vision. So that was the content of the exhibition. And then not to forget, there are a lot of people who helped us to do this, to realize this exhibition. And of course, this is just a simple credit. And there were a lot of people involved in this, and mostly the students from NUS. And also, I would like to especially mention my colleague, my ex-colleague, Oscar. I think without the team with Oscar, none of this will be possible. And so I would like to just simply credit on this. And the model that I was saying is something like this. So this is kind of like the student proposing the vision of 50 years later of Singapore, understanding from this map the reality. So this was the content of the exhibition. This map here, it shows the 55 neighborhoods planning of Singapore. And what the exhibition is trying to showcase is something that is different from planning. Planning is what you have in terms of the framework, but the reality, it may not be exactly in the perfect shape of the planning. So this is why I say the planning and the reality, because the planning is what you might want it to have in terms of the management or organization, but in terms of the reality, it means that it's more responding to the needs of the people. And so the reality might be something different. And then therefore in this exhibition, we are trying to provide insight of the reality and to also give some findings from what we found out. And so there are 6 maps, and I'm going to step up from the screen from now, and because I don't want to destroy the beautiful images. There are 6 maps to show. The first map is about the density. Density is always the first thing we need to know in order to understand the relationship between people and the space in the city. The first thing I would like to mention is about the population density. In Singapore, which is the total area is about 782 kilometers squared. 71% out of the population are Singapore residents. So what do I mean by this is that 29% or almost, let's say 30% of Singapore population are either migrant workers or foreign residents. So the pure Singapore residents are only around 70%, around 71%. So the data is changing all the time. The one that I'm going to mention from now on is some data that is based on 2015, which is when the exhibition was held, when the research project was being held. And around that period, roughly 4 million people were the Singapore residents, and the total was around 5.5 million. The population density for the entire Singapore is 70 people per hectare. Let's take city of New York as an example to compare. New York, which is 786 kilometers squared, has a population density of 107 people per hectare. And Tokyo Central Area, which is around 627 kilometers squared, has a population density of 153 people per hectare. So as a reference, Hong Kong, it has an average population density of 63 people per hectare. So when you see these numbers, you may not think that Singapore is a high dense city, but in fact, Singapore is a country, and then it has a lot of other lands, not only the residential land, but if you include the rest of the land, like the catchment area, it has a lot of land that is not residential. So for the consolidated residential area, only taking the residential area, which means excluding all the lands that are for commercial or industry, etc., etc., it becomes 495 people per hectare, which makes it extremely high. And this is why Singapore maybe is considered as a city of high density living. Now looking closely into the Singapore neighborhoods. So as I mentioned, there are 55 neighborhoods in Singapore. And from these neighborhoods, Bedok, which is the area that has been shown here, is a neighborhood that has the highest number of Singapore residents living with a total of 7.6%. So when I say Singapore resident, it means the 4 million people and not the total, which is 5.5 million. And now the densest neighborhood is Choa Chu Kang. It has 287 Singapore residents per hectare. In terms of housing density, the average housing density of the HDB area is 130 housing units per hectare. To compare, Melbourne, which is considered the most livable city in the world, has a housing density in residential areas of 12 housing units per hectare. So Singapore obviously is quite high in terms of the housing units per hectare. Outram is the highest built-up neighborhood with a total of 24% of building footprint area, which means land occupied by residential buildings. Less than 35% of footprint area coverage of a neighborhood is considered a good standard. So this means that all neighborhoods in Singapore meet a good standard. Moving on to the age group, Bedok is the neighborhood that has the highest percentage of aging population. 9% are 65 years or more. And Jurong West, which is here, is the neighborhood that has the highest percentage of young population. Almost 8% out of the resident population are between 6 and 14 years old. And in terms of ethnic groups, Bedok is the neighborhood that has the highest percentage of Chinese population, 7.5% out of the total Chinese resident population. And on the other hand, Woodland is a neighborhood that has the highest percentage of Malay and Indian population with 12.3 and 7.8 for each. This is quite understandable for Woodlands because Woodland is nearby the Singapore-Malaysia Causeway, and then therefore those people who have maybe the relatives over to the Malaysian side, they would prefer maybe to live closer to the Causeway so that they can go and visit Malaysia very often. And now we move on to the living city. The living city shows the living environment in Singapore, and this map shows the public residential area, which are the HDBs, followed by later on I will show you the private residential area, which includes the condominiums, landed properties, and other housing units and apartments. So in Singapore, total of 13.4% of the land area is for residential uses. According to HDB, the estimate population living in HDB area is 3.2 million, which means the 83% of the Singapore residents, which is equal to 59% of the total population of the country. HDB areas constitute 48% of the total residential areas of Singapore, which is 6.5% of Singapore land area. In Hong Kong, for example, 6.8% of the total land area is developed for residential use. So it's quite similar in terms of percentage. In these HDB buildings, the average residential space per person is 35 square meters. More than 30 square meters of residential space per person is considered a good standard. And in Hong Kong, the average residential space per person is 12.8 square meter. So although Singapore is rather a high dense living condition, they will have a decent amount of space, residential space per person. Okay. Bukit Merah is a neighborhood that has the highest percentage of 1 and 2 room flats in HDB, which is a total of 17%. So Bukit Merah neighborhood is next to Queenstown, and this is also one of this area that will be built in phase 1 for the emergency apartments. Jurong West is a neighborhood that has the highest percentage of 5-room and executive flats in HDB, 10% out of the total. Jurong West is also the neighborhood that has the highest percentage of people living in HDB housing units, 8% of the total population living in HDB. Now moving on to private residential area. This map shows the private residential area. If I just go back again to public residential area map, you can see from this 83% of the Singapore residents are actually living here. On the other hand, the rest, including the non-Singaporeans, they are living in a private residential area. So 41% of the total population of Singapore lives in this private residential area. Private residential area constitutes of 52% of the total residential area, 7% of Singapore's land. The average residential space per person in private residential area is 119 square meters. So previously I mentioned the average residential space per person for HDB, they are 35 square meter. And Bedok, again, is a neighborhood that has the highest percentage of Singapore residents living in condominium, which is 11% of total resident population. Moreover, Bedok also has the highest percentage of Singapore residents living in landed property, which is 18% of the total residential population. Now we move to the service city. The service city studies the spatial distribution of facilities in order to evaluate their diversity, balanced distribution, and population access. In other words, facilities should be located within a certain walking distances from residential area to be accessible for the people living in the neighborhood. The service city map shows the 5 different types of facilities considered as primary and basic in our daily needs. So this includes healthcare, culture, sports, social welfare, and education. The circle shows the catchment area of the different facilities and the proximity radius covered in the walking distance. The overlapping of the different catchment areas shows the simultaneous coverage and proximity to areas, indicating those areas that has a better mixture and distribution. So in terms of the quantitative analysis, 10.4% of the land area of Singapore is dedicated to facilities. 98.6% of the residential area is covered by at least one facility. And only 1% of the population has a simultaneous access to the 5 different types of facilities. Next is the consuming city. The consuming city map shows the local activities, which are economic activities used on daily basis for the citizens. Therefore, it is important to have these in close proximity to home. In this category, we include the standard ones such as supermarkets, convenience stores, and shopping malls, but we also included that are more specific for Singapore, such as hawker centers, food centers, and wet markets. And for this, 62% of the residential area are covered by at least one activity, which is a total of 31% of the Singapore population. If you compare with the public housing area, like this is quite understandable. Most of these activities are in close proximity to HDB neighborhoods. On the contrary, the private housing areas, they lack in local activities. This is because the local activity is part of the HDB planning. This is something that I have mentioned. In Singapore urbanism, they are integrating the garden city concept and also the neighborhood unit, which were being materialized in the implementation of the HDB neighborhood planning. So this is why the public housing has more convenience in terms of the activities. So this is why, apart from the central business districts, the CBD areas, the residents living in private housing will only benefit in terms of the local activities if they are nearby the HDB areas. So if I compare and overlap with the private residential area, you can see a lot of the private areas, they are not covered with these local activities. Now the flow city. Mobility is one of the most important issues in our cities today, and therefore the flow city is about streets and public transportation. Nowadays, concerning about the sustainability of the city, we want to reduce the amount of car dependency and then promote more usage of the public transportation system. And this is why enhancing various forms of mobility such as pedestrians, bicycle and public transportation will be important in order to reduce the car dependency. In a sustainable model, space for cars should not exceed 25%, which means that 75% should be for pedestrian use. This will create a walkable neighborhood where walking will be encouraged amongst the residents. This map shows the street and public transport. 7.6% of Singapore's land area is for the use of vehicles, which is for parking and street space for the cars. And there is one vehicle for every 4 Singaporean residents. One vehicle in Singapore has an average of 61 square meters of street space. On the other hand, one Singapore resident has only 3 square meters of the street space. A good standard of street space to have a walkable neighborhood is between 20 to 25% of the land area. In Barcelona, for example, 50% of its street space is for pedestrians. But for Singapore, Orchard, which is here, has the highest percentage of street space, which is 32%. But most of the neighborhood has less than a 20% of land area dedicated for a street. If we look into the public transportation system, 41% of the population lives within a 300 meters distance from a bus stop. 15% of the population lives within 500 meters distance from MRT or LRT station. 15% of the population has access within 300 meters distance to a bicycle network. But this will probably increase in the near future once the park connectors will be completed. 42% of the population has access to either MRT, LRT or bus system within their walking distances. 5% of the population has access to the 3 mobility networks. However, the desired value would be that at least 80% of the residential population will have an alternative to these access to different mobility network systems. 70% of the street space in Singapore is devoted to vehicle. This is a diagram to show some of the cross-section of street spaces in Singapore. And this is an example of an image of a street space. 70% of the street space in Singapore is devoted to vehicles and 15% is dedicated for the pedestrian use, which shows a very car-oriented distribution of the street space. 18% of the street space in Singapore is for green spaces. This is around 1.4% of Singapore land area. This is quite visible from this image. In terms of walkability, according to UN Habitat, a standard of 100 street crossings per kilometer square allows to have a walkable environment to generate street life and for moving goods and services productively and efficiently. So just to give you an example of Tokyo, if I show the highest, the average and the lowest, the highest is in Kita-Senju area, which is a densely built up wooden housing area with 695 intersections per square kilometer. The average is in Den Chofu area, which is quite a pleasant residential area, very well carefully planned. It has 450 intersections per square kilometer. The lowest is in Konan area, where there are a lot of these big warehouses with only 38 intersections per square kilometer. So in Singapore, the number of street crossing per square kilometer is in average 21, and only Orchard, Outram, Rochor, Serangoon and Singapore River achieve the standard. This will mean that Singapore is a very unwalkable city, but if you look carefully into the precinct and understanding the characteristic of the HDB area, the space can be recognized more in terms of a Nolly map. A Nolly map is a representation of a figureground diagram with blocks and buildings shaded and public spaces left blank. Nolly included enclosed public spaces such as the colonnades and the Pantheon as open civic space. So if you look at this one carefully here, this is the Pantheon and these are the colonnades. So the Pantheon is more of a public accessible area, so this is why it's being left blank. Similar to this, the precinct of HDB areas in Singapore can be recognized differently when you see just the building footprint and when you draw a Nolly map, which allows the pedestrians to have a surface accessibility rather than a linear network. So this diagram shows a precinct in Bukit Panjang. If you take the white one, they are the buildings, and these black ones, they are the walkable area. But these buildings are designed with these void decks. So if you redraw this in terms of the Nolly map, actually a lot of the space, they are quite accessible. Taking this into consideration, although Singapore might score low in terms of the number of street crossing, it doesn't mean that it is unwalkable, but we can understand the neighborhood in an archipelago way, where each island has a free surface accessibility to move around to fulfill their daily activities, because the precinct, they will have all the services allocated nearby. So this diagram is from Toa Payoh. What I mean by archipelago is all of these. are small islands to form an archipelago, and each of them they will have void deck. So actually within their little island, which is the precinct, they will be able to have a free accessibility that is more of a surface rather than a linear. Lastly, the Joy City. Open spaces are essential for the livability of a city. So living closely to parks, trails and recreation facility is related to greater use of facilities and more recreation physical activity. So it is important to find a balance between built area and open spaces for resting and socializing. Singapore is credited with the quality of being a city in the garden due to the amount of open spaces that it has. So 30% of Singapore land area is covered by green spaces, including nature reserves, parks, local open spaces, green spaces for streets, etc., etc. So the Joy City studies the different types of open spaces and their use, dividing them into two main categories, which are public open space and private and restricted open space. So this one shows the public open space. We consider the public open space to be those usable and accessible to everyone. 4 scales of open space have been included in this analysis: nature parks, district parks, and local open spaces. The map shows the proximity radius for each type of open space and defines the catchment area of the different spaces. 10.5% of the land area of Singapore is dedicated to public open spaces, and 4% of this is for local open spaces that are in between residential buildings. Typically, these areas are not calculated, but we included in the study because this is one of the unique aspects that contains in the development of Singapore HDB areas. The red area you see is the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, which has 2,880 hectares. So if you compare this with Manhattan Central Park in New York, that is 341 hectares. So you can imagine how big this area is in Singapore. The amount of open space per person in Singapore is 15 square meters. New York has 29 square meters per person, and London has 27 square meters. The World Health Organization, the WHO, recommends a minimum of 10 square meters per inhabitant. We move to the private and restricted open spaces. So these areas are spaces that, although they are open, they are publicly restricted or non-accessible, which is creating precincts in the city that cannot be used and accessed by the majority. Private and restricted open spaces are based on the URA Master Plan, and they include private residential open spaces, a golf course, special use areas, utilities, and agricultural spaces. 18.4% of the land area of Singapore is dedicated to private and restricted open spaces. 26% of them are open spaces in private residential areas, which is 4.8% of the land area of Singapore. Now we move to the last chapter, and I'm back on screen again. The last chapter is about City in the Garden, and why do I say fiction? So to explain about the fiction part, I'm going to quote from the book by Harari, which was published in 2014. It's about the Sapiens, a brief history of humankind. So some of you might have already read this book. It's quite striking to understand that the first ever revolution that happened to humankind that was able to differentiate from the rest of the sapiens was that we had this cognitive revolution that happened 70,000 years ago. And this cognitive revolution is about the ability of sapiens to cooperate in large numbers with its unique capacity to believe in things that is purely from the imagination. So the example of this is like God, nation, money, and so human rights. So money is, I think, is a good example. Money is just a paper, a printed paper, but we believe that there is a value. And so this is the fiction part that we have. Harari claims also that all large-scale human cooperation system emerged from the sapiens' cognitive capacity for fiction. So the fiction part has been proven from this statue that you can see here, which is a lion-headed figure, which the head is a lion and then the body is human. So this doesn't, of course, exist in reality, but obviously there is an imagination by the sapiens that created to believe in this figure. So this is the fiction that they have been created, and then in order to have a collective group together, you need this fiction. So going back to what happens after the independence by Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, this is the last part that I'm going to mention, which is about the politics. And this politics is typically you would understand it as a vision, but I think we can rephrase it into a fiction. So what is this fiction that he created? So the fiction is, instead of Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, the fiction of Singapore is the city in the garden. So there was a greening campaign in Singapore in 1960. It started from 1963. The objective of this was to make Singapore a very green city. And every year, a minimum of 10,000 saplings were being planted as part of this campaign. So as you can see from this image here, everybody who are Singaporeans, who are living in the land of Singapore, they joined this campaign. The girls, boys, children, uncles and aunties, no matter if you're female or male, no matter your age, whoever, all the people in Singapore, they joined this campaign to plant trees. And trees are something that when you plant the trees, they are not big from the beginning. So they are just saplings. And so you can see from this image, it was a very, very small plant from the beginning. But in 20 years, it will grow to become a tree. So this is the imagination part that I mean, where you need to believe that this tree will signify their future. And of course, after 50 years, all these trees that they planted, they grew to become a real tree. And then nowadays, you will see these green everywhere. And Singapore is also famous for all these rooftop gardens, and they are quite difficult in terms of technique to plant this on the rooftop. And also you have in between the buildings as well. So to conclude, the key point of Singapore is that they had these three aspects that combine together. And of course, one of them is the economy, and the other one is the space. And then moreover, the fact that they had this fiction that tied everyone together is probably the key point of the success of Singapore development. How come this is really important is for economy and space, it could have been done very top-down, but the fact, I think the success of Singapore is because from the very beginning after the independence, they involved the people to cooperate in the nation making. So that created a place for people and a space for people. And this is why Singapore ends up a really beautiful country like this. And I think that I think a lot of other countries around Asia, especially, they are trying to learn from Singapore planning. But I think what is missing is that you need to also understand the last part that I have mentioned, which is the fiction part. This is what made people to mobilize in order to join in the activity, in the actions of space making, in the place making. So I think this is something that we need to, it's something that we cannot see, and then it is not a method. And I think every nation will have its own different fiction that is more relatable for them. But I think the key success is, the key point of the success of Singapore is the fact that there was a fiction, and to make people to mobilize and let them join in the creation of the beautiful city. So this is the end of my lecture today. I hope you liked it. If you are interested, please subscribe to my channel. Bye bye.